Now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Seth Bledsoe, Assistant Professor in the Department of Textual, Historical, and Systematic Studies of Judaism and Christianity at Radboud University in the Netherlands. In fall of 2018, he joined Radboud University, having previously held research and teaching positions in the U.S., Hungary, and Germany. He's published several articles and a monograph on the Book of Ahikar, the wisdom of the Aramaic Book of Ahikar, unraveling a discourse of uncertainty and distress, 2022, which arose out of a habilitation written in Lausanne. And as you heard him featured in our last panel as well, so he sort of spans two. He's also co-edited a set of essays called Between Wisdom and Torah, Discourses on Wisdom and Law in Second Temple Judaism, that arose out of two conferences, and works across various areas of Second Temple Jewish wisdom, and has also researched and written shorter works and presentations on old age, restfulness, and disability. His presentation for this workshop is Difficulties in Building an Empire, Imperial Tensions in the Literature of the Hebrew Bible During the Achaemenid Period. Welcome.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here today. I consider it quite an honor. And a quick apology to my co-presenters for the conference that I didn't share anything beforehand aside from the abstract. But I hope that what I present today will still be a spark for some discussion alongside my colleague Conrad. I begin with a short story. Some years ago, I was visiting a university and walking around it with the provost, and he was giving me basically a tour of the university. And I made a comment, having seen several of buildings being constructed or worked on, and I remarked on, hey, there's lots of construction going on. And he said, here's the thing about universities. If you ever visit one and there's no construction, there's cause for concern, because if you're not building, you're failing. Now, I leave you to decide the measure of wisdom for this about universities, and maybe some, late stage capitalism desperation there. But I bring it up to consider the idea that there may be some truth to this when it comes to empires. If empires are not building, they are failing. Now, I'm being a bit playful here with the word building. Of course, the provost more or less was talking about material, although it's also symbolic. However, with empire, I mean something more. I mean the construction of empire itself, which involves physical building projects, but also the construction of space, of imperial subjectivities, of power relations, and of the normativizing taxonomies and theopolitical discourses that structure them. Empire, therefore, are like societies. They are, quote, always in a process construction. They are founded again, day after day, year after year, in a variety of ways. This quote comes from a recent essay by Marta Lorenzen and Caroline Wallace, which evaluated the role that building activities in the Neo-Assyrian period played, quote, in the constant construction of the political society, end quote. Now, I came across this article after submitting this idea, because I've worked a little bit on some building, but it has completely reshaped the way I've thought about this, because they focus on the importance of building projects and the so-called propaganda narrative of empire works and how it works on several levels. Now, of course, the completed buildings themselves could certainly be seen as visible presence of imperial ideology, from administrative structures within cities like granaries or other treasuries, to fortified structures along roadways. We might even think of, say, countryside buildings, such as the so-called estates or perhaps forts dating to the Persian period, Yehud, that dot the countryside. Some discussion there, of course, by Fletcher and Silverman, who offer a nuanced presentation, and also in the background of this as well, that even if they were estates, that they still conveyed something about empire, whether as royal domains or something like that. Well, regardless of the immediately visual symbolism of an actual building or structure, the most impactful might just be the process of building or constructing the buildings themselves. Building programs require a great deal of materials, labor, and administrative coordination. Raw goods, including food for workers, are needed in abundance and often move from one locale to another. They are the physical manifestation of imperial extraction processes. Laborers as well. They are often conscripted or enslaved or compelled in some various ways, taken from local as well as non-local populaces. Their bodies, in a sense, are used in effort to construct and sustain the imperial project. All of this, of course, takes up space and time, a physical segment of the land or city, as well as the days, weeks, years, and so forth of one's attention, which is occupied with the construction of empire. I'll try not to use air quotes too much. And thus not with something else. Building then is not just an act of, say, replacement, but expansion. Replacing one space with an imperial space, the territory of empire is increased. And I mean that even if, say, the boundaries have been set, as we've talked about at various times, that it's still being expanded or built within the boundaries by each time a space is built or rebuilt. But such building projects and building empire in general are, of course, fraught with tension. Again, we might think both materially and symbolically. The administration and coordination of building projects is not straightforward. We tend to think by royal decree, build this, do this, and then it just magically happens. There's a whole host of bureaucratic challenges therein. In fact, Wallace and Lorenzen have argued this point quite decisively, again, for the Neo-Assyrian period, pointing to several examples from the state archives that highlight the daily difficulties of running an empire. And far from being smooth running or self-regulating easy endeavor, we see imperial agents struggling to carry out their work. And we think about complaints or the governors running away from the duty or the ilku workers like shirking and all. There's a whole long list. I suggest you consult that article. My bibliography will be on the last slide. But beyond the bureaucratic, there's also, of course, the looming aspect of empire itself as an oppressive force. And thus, all or at least most of this labor depends upon the so-called willing subjects. And here in the background of my mind, we can think of any number of social and political theorists. A whole subsection of this written paper goes into that with Berdue, Lincoln, and a little bit of Geertz. And often, and I'll probably bring this up a little bit later, post-colonial studies that sort of seek to situate this in terms of the subaltern or cultural hybridity, a la Baba, and so forth. Anyway, that's sort of aside, and I'll mention those at some point in passing, or you can see it in the written version later. Now, Wallace and Lorenzen acknowledge some of these difficulties and argue that building projects, in their very requirement of participation, are meaningful processes whereby subjects are integrated into the imperial script. And this is the point I really want to focus on today. The integration takes place across many intersections of social and political lines. With their material focus as it relates to ideology, they point to how building projects bring together different populations, both geographically and socially. We can even think that in the biblical literature, with the building of the temple itself required participation of foreign kings. So even in a sort of local building project, I'll come back to that point later. It also, most importantly, brought in the role of the king, who is, in the Neo-Assyrian ideology at least, the ultimate overseer or builder of all of these projects. And they point to a stela. I wish I actually got the photo. I didn't. A stela of Ashurbanipal depicting him holding a basket of clay on his head, like any given mundane building worker. So this sort of juxtaposition of the lowest, right, with the highest. Anyway. In other words, the building project, both physically and symbolically, brings together socially and politically discrete groups and forces them to interact when they otherwise wouldn't. This, of course, can result in tension, but in the process of the building itself, and say completing the building, although I'll say later about whether or not it's ever completed, it ends up reinforcing the social structures. In other words, they must be brought together to reinscribe the lines that are drawn between them in the first place. This is where I want to step in at last in turning from the material, which was the primary focus of Wallace and Lorenzen, with social and political theory behind, to literary representations of building. So I'd in fact like to consider how looking at some literary representations of building can contribute to a broader understanding of the ongoing totalizing but never totalized process of constructing empire. We're precisely looking at some texts in the Hebrew Bible that feature building projects, especially, as you might guess, the temple within the Persian imperial context. What I suggest that we find in these literary representations corresponds to the broader paradigms of empire, including the troubles or difficulties, I think we went back and forth on the title, that permeate the theopolitical and social cosmographies. Now, as Conrad has nicely illustrated or pointed out, in some sense, nearly every text in the Hebrew Bible can be read through a Persian period lens. And it may be no surprise that there's just a lot of building. If you just look for the word bana or other building words in Hebrew, it's all throughout. There's a lot of building or building imagery in the text. Now, while Conrad is focused on some examples of the Torah in the Persian period, I want to point to a couple of passages in the prophets and the writings. And of these two main passages that are in focus, that is Isaiah 44 and let's see if that goes, and 44 through 45 and Ezra 1 through 6. Of course, these are perhaps the two most famous texts in relation to the Achaemenid Empire or the Persian Empire because of their direct mention of Cyrus, and especially in relation to the building of the temple. Now, a side note, because this is, of course, only about the literary representation, I'm not thinking about the actual building of it, but about the literary representation. And in looking at both of these texts, I want to highlight the tensions that we can find therein that help us understand how building motifs in this literature can reflect the tensions inherent to an imperial logic. And this can be mapped on, say, the cosmic versus local, the center versus periphery, or the vertical versus horizontal. In fact, here I'd like to adjust, instead of saying versus, that's what I put in my abstract, I would say and, because what I suggest is that in each of these, where they may seem pro or anti on whatever way we map, the argument basically I'm trying to make is that each of these texts actually holds these two impulses, compliance, resistance, in tension, right? Rather than identifying a discrete set of texts that we link to the Persian period as this one's pro, this one's anti, I suggest that we can actually see tensions in all of them. Maybe that's a bit too convenient, but I think it can be a helpful way for thinking through these texts as products or constructs of the Persian imperial literary history. So let's turn to Isaiah 44 through 45. And I bring out a couple of short excerpts. Don't know why the numbers of the verse, I guess when I copied and pasted it, lost it. This is all in RSV. I've noted that. Now, the final lines of Isaiah 44 through the beginning of chapter 45 is perhaps one of the most discussed passages connecting Hebrew literature to the Achaemenid era. In addition to mentioning Cyrus by name, there's the rather glaring designation of Cyrus as Yahweh's anointed. That's in 45:1, not right here. And that is, of course, in Hebrew, Mashiach, and in Greek, Christos. So it's always fun to when I go over this with my students, to say, here's the Christ. Especially after I've told them at the beginning of class, there's no Messiah, there's no Christ in the Bible. We'll get to that later. Commentators often remark that this is the only non-Israelite ever given such a title, and is generally reserved for either priests or more often for Israelite kings. Of course, the attention to the Messianic status of Cyrus is in part a reflex of its later Christian resonances and this sort of thing, that you may interpret it in that way. But either way, is it a rather positive portrayal of the Persian monarch and his literary integration into Israelite royal ideology, as well as the prophetic mode. Now, before jumping to that passage as well, I wanted to begin here with excerpt 1a, I call it, and 44, 24 through 28. I think for sake of time, I won't read it, but I want to draw your attention to how this passage, as well as the broader passage, has an interweaving of creation, the creation of the world, and the call of Cyrus, indicating a blending of God's cosmic design as it relates to the Persian ruler. The creation motif directly raised at the end of chapter 44 is almost axiomatic, as reference to Adonai's creative power quite regularly serves to buttress subsequent claims about Adonai's sovereignty. And we see this in all sorts of passages. Think Job, and Psalm 74, among many others. Likewise, the allusion to creation serves to support the promise that God will be able to turn things around on the human arena. Again, thinking Psalm 74, for example. Specifically, as it has to do with the ruined state, in this case, a ruined state of Jerusalem and Judah or Yehud more broadly, through the instrument of Cyrus. This echoes the joining of creation with kingship in many of the Achaemenid royal inscriptions. Now, I mean echo not in a direct kind of way. Janssen, in a 2021 article, says of the inscriptions, a key aspect of Achaemenid ideology is the central place of Her Mazda as creator, where 70%, or he identifies at least 70% of Achaemenid inscriptions, longer than a paragraph, contain a reference to creation. And these references are always the inscription's first element, preceding even the king's first-person introduction. The standard creation formula links Ahura Mazda's primal act of establishing order of creation to the appointment of the Achaemenid king. Remember, king and creation are connected. Now, it could be tempting to see some measure of influence of Persian imperial ideology on Second Isaiah specifically, of course, in light of Cyrus mentioned. And others have argued that. I think in an article from Jason Silverman, 2017. Although I'm a little bit more cautious about saying it. Maybe it's just always cautious from following Christine Mitchell. That even if they don't know the specific formula from the inscriptions, the order of it and the outlook is fairly consistent with pro-Persian slant, at least in her words. Now, regardless of any direct influence, there's a shared connection between creation, kingship, and building. Janssen points to several inscriptions of Xerxes and Darius, whose structure follows a pattern of creation, the establishment of king, then the description of the king's construction projects. In the Isaiah passage, we might also note the tight parataxis between the image of rebuilding cities and the cosmic creative act of forming dry land from deep waters. This could be mere rhetorical hyperbole by suggesting that the building of a city or rebuilding is as significant as creation itself, but we could see this as emblematic of the cosmic local dynamic. Janssen, again, in a different article from 2016, says of the Persian inscriptions adjoining of construction and projects and creation, quote, Ahura Mazda has created the world and the empire, and the building projects are a manifestation of this truth, end quote. Beyond just a manifestation of the divine ideology manifestation of the divine power be the king, it may also have a deeper significance. The imperial project in Achaemenid ideology is to make order out of chaos. Thus, a city left unbuilt is contrary to the creative order initiated the creation of the world. The implications of the immediate likening of building or rebuilding a city to the creation of the world then are profound, and not just in its, say, miraculousness. Like, for example, we might think of cities that are imagined as that lie in utter irrevocable ruin. And it's late. I'm jelly. Like the chaotic desert or a deep ocean or the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel. I know these aren't necessarily always cities, but this idea of something that's been destroyed so utterly cannot be revived. But it also, beyond that, sort of miraculous, it might have cosmic significance. That is, we might read this parallel backwards as well as forwards. If the building of the world is paradigmatic for the building of cities, perhaps the building of the city can have positive or negative implications on the state of the cosmos itself. Cosmic informs the local, informs the cosmic. At the same time, acknowledging the potential messiness of the world, whether cosmic or local or both, harkens to the notion that the divine's creative activity is constant. It must be maintained. So too must the empire be maintained through construction, literarily and metaphorically. So we might think then about inscriptions as the sort of permanence that we talked about already today, and the dissemination as the maintenance of that permanency. This is where we are first introduced, without preface, in 45.1 not 45.1, in 44.28, we are introduced after this sort of creation motif and building motif. We are introduced without preface to Cyrus. It says, he is my shepherd. I've lost my spot, so I'll read it here. He is my shepherd, and he shall carry out all my purpose. The purpose is not clearly stated, but elaborated through yet another type of rhetorical parataxis. It is being followed immediately by a repeated promise the city of Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and even more, its temple. It follows then that the purpose of Cyrus is to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, or at least its foundation. Now, what this passage only implicitly joins, the subsequent chapter states plainly, Cyrus is to build the city. And here we can jump. Now, I've skipped over the subsequent voices, jumped straight to the anointed status of Cyrus, which has drawn most of the focus. And I should remind that this sort of split between 44 and 25, of course, is much later arbitrary split of chapters, and we can read them in sequence. And sort of a back and forth between building or creation, then building, then Cyrus, then building, then Cyrus as anointing, and then a long series of verses of Cyrus as destroying. A whole different article that hopefully comes out later this year. I talk about this contrast between destroying and building. set that aside for now. So I point out then, rather than the Messiah first of Cyrus, I want to draw our attention to later in verses 12 to 13, where we can find a similar combination of creation, Cyrus, and building. I made the earth and created humankind on it. This is the Lord speaking. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I commanded all their host. I have aroused Cyrus in righteousness, and I will make all his paths straight. He shall build my city and set my exiles free. Again, a parataxis here. There's an ascendant, that there's no connection and no sort of transition about how this is related, but I've put them in parallel and highlighted a few things here to draw your attention to the association. Thus, rhetorically, with one brush, the prophetic voice of God revels in its own creative acts, and with the very next brush enumerates the ways that this ultimate power is working in Cyrus. The parallel presentation highlights some of the ways that are suggestive of an intimate connection between Cyrus and God through the process of building, including building as created. Cyrus stands as the supreme deity's anointed one, tasked with building the city, an act likened to God's totalizing creative endeavor. In light of this passage more broadly, we have the building project a map of Yehudite's direct line from the local to the cosmic. Cyrus's building directive is fronted by a sweeping act of destruction, as mentioned, that likewise jumbles the image of a building and the earth. After a promise to use Cyrus to subdue nations and kings, Yahweh will level mountains and break doors. Again, mountains and doors, cosmic, local building. I'll skip down here for a second. Now, of course, it's worth pointing out that much of this, what Cyrus will do is actually Cyrus as a tool in Yahweh's hand. But the only verbs that are specifically of what Cyrus will do are the building verbs. So, well, do my purpose, which I've suggested means building, and build, the very word itself, and Cyrus's builder. So his role, at least in some sense of agency, if not autonomy, is role as builder. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit for sake of time, but I basically want to draw our attention to the way that this is presented as what is actually going on here with Cyrus as a Messiah, as a king, Yahweh in the building project. And in fact, I ask the sort of maybe problematic question of it's often treated as exceptional because Cyrus, the foreign king, is presented as doing such grand things of being a Mashiach, and building, which David and Solomon and other Israelite kings do. And we might then ask, is Cyrus even a foreigner? And this rhetorical question is led with a little bit of critique of the reference to Cyrus as foreign king. In other words, is Cyrus perhaps naturalized as a local king in this process, and thus reflects in some sense an imperial script, where at least on the vertical axis, that Cyrus, that the Israelites belong to Cyrus, and Cyrus belongs to Yehud, by way of the relationship of creation and building. This also might be then contrasted on the horizontal if we understand that this passage is situated right between, or broadly speaking, second Isaiah is located right between Sennacherib, who attempts to destroy the temple in 36 through 39 of Isaiah. And then immediately, even later in 45, we have a brief reference to Egypt and other places that will be subdued. And then, of course, later, a re-reference to Babylon. So on a broader level, we had this sort of contrast drawn between Cyrus and Sennacherib, and Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar. So on a sort of horizontal level, it establishes Yehud, or Cyrus and Persia, all in this sort of vertical line, as in within this sort of same kind of trajectory, whereas there's a contrast drawn when we take it on the horizontal of Israel is with Persia, is with at least Cyrus, and is with Adonai, whereas these other empires are anti. Now, there have been a number of, say, arguments that this is actually sort of subversive reading of making Cyrus a tool of Yahweh, much like even the servant Nebuchadnezzar is servant of Yahweh, is in some sense sort of reflects of cultural hybridity. I'm going to summarize here a bit for sake of time, but this idea that they've appropriated this notion of empire, but then twisted it for their own sort of subaltern ends. But I sort of want to leave that tension in the air and turn to the next passage that I'll only have a couple of minutes to talk about. And that's in Ezra 1 through 6, chapters 1 through 6. I draw our attention first to the very first verses. And again, the numbers went away. I don't know why. where we have the opening of the book of Ezra in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia. In order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also written edict declared, thus says King Cyrus of Persia. I think I'm just reading it, you all can read it. He charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. All right, so here we have again Cyrus directly connected to building. Now, what precedes, though, after this clear and direct imperial command to build are a series of bureaucratic tensions, one might call it, if we think of Lorenzen and Wallace in the background, because even though Cyrus decrees it, it doesn't happen automatically. Now, I've called them bureaucratic tensions, but of course, we often interpret these first 6 chapters as very sort of group identity and ethnic sort of identity focused. And I don't think that's wrong per se, but the question then is what is happening between chapter 1 and chapter 6, where the construction is actually realized. And there have been many readings of this that have taken sort of redactional, source critical, or even sort of literary historical of seeing the Aramaic letters and so forth, of what they might reflect of different viewpoints or different texts at various times. And I'm not sort of denying that this range of possibility. What I'm suggesting is if we read 1 through 6 all together, that what we see then, rather than as sort of different diachronic kind of representations, but is rather in toto as a script of tension between a realization of the imperial command and the difficulties that comes with the realization, with that realization, and that it's meted out both on the vertical and horizontal axes. Yeah, thank you. And so I'll point to a couple of examples. So, for example, we have here in Ezra 4, 1 through 5, where one of the resistances to the building, or the challenges come because others want to come and build with them, with the returnees, and the leaders, that they're called the adversaries, but the leaders, including Zerubbabel, who was just mentioned, and Conrad's, says, no, you can't build with us. Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families in Israel said to them, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King of Cyrus of Persia has commanded us. And so what we have here is competition on a horizontal level, and this notion of we alone will build includes Cyrus. Cyrus, again, is seen as part of it. And this competition could be reflective, like I said, of what Wallace and Lorenzen say, of this sort of competition on the sort of mid-level governor kind of level of who gets to do what within the imperial scheme. But I think I want to think more broadly about what the back and forth and the not yet realized building projects in the 6 chapters suggest that what we have here is even when it is completed, at the end, there is still the latent tension because of the disagreement that's going on. And this includes on the vertical level. And that's why it's important, because what we have in these chapters is that it's actually officially stopped at one point by Artaxerxes. He stops the building project. And the way that he stops it is that the adversaries make reference to the building of the temple in the past as an act of rebellion. So what we have here is the sort of intersection between building as rebellion and building as being part of the empire. Now, ultimately, and I'll stop with this example. Ultimately, though, this gets resolved in 613, where we see that even though the Israelites are pitted as anti-Persian in their attempt to build, this is reconciled here in the final summation of it. They finished the building by the command. This is the ta'im that Kate brought up, of God of Israel, and by the decree, again, ta'im, although it's pointed differently, but it's the same word, of Cyrus. But not just Cyrus, evoking chapter 1, but of Darius, who was in the previous chapter, started in chapter 5, and Artaxerxes in chapter 4. And thus uniting the 3 kings that had all been mentioned before, and according to one purpose. And this sort of reintegration of Artaxerxes, of course, comes in its culmination in chapter 7, as was mentioned already. What I suggest here, and I think I have to stop now, is one of the things that's also latent within this is that we have here, I didn't hold it, but I meant to, Both in chapter 1, the prophesying of Jeremiah is linked with this historical, but also the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah. Now, as we just heard from Conrad, and not to disagree strongly, Haggai is often mentioned as this sort of very anti-Persian, right? That ends with this overthrowing kingdoms. But if we read, the question is, why does Ezra, or whoever's reading this, we'll call him Ezra, not know what happens in Haggai? Zechariah also is a sort of obliquely anti-Persia, as it's often read. But Haggai, let's take that as the example, is this really anti-Persian. And there's a way of reading, this might force us, I would suggest, not only with thinking of rereading Ezra as latent with tensions, but rereading Haggai with his final verses of not as representing sort of this call to overthrow kingdoms, i.e. Persia, but also a mimicry in some sense of the Persian imperial outlook that matches this idea of the integration of the two. So what we find really in Ezra, as well as in reading Haggai side by side, is that we have a coincidence of both integration and division. That building then, or the script of building in each of these texts, becomes a liminal space where we see these sort of tensions played out. And yes, in some sense, they are realized in the building of the temple, but we're left, nevertheless, with the text as a whole. So we read the text as a whole, rather than dividing into parts. We're left with the text where the tension is still there. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you for signaling the time, and hope to have laid out briefly some of the key points that open up a discussion for thinking about the construction of literature as it relates to theopolitical and social context of the Achaemenid period. Thank you.